They laughed at the ragged old man offering to fix a luxury car for a meal, never realizing they were mocking a living legend. The rain hammered down on a city that didn't see him. A ghost in tattered fatigues, staring through the glass at a silver Aston Martin no one could fix. He shuffled into the bright, pristine showroom, drawing stares and smirks. "Can I fix it for a meal?" he asked, voice rough from years of silence. The salesman laughed, unaware they were standing before a legend, a man whose hands had once resurrected machines under enemy fire, where failure meant death. Tonight wasn't about money or glory, it was about survival. But what happened next would shatter their assumptions, ignite a storm of headlines, and reveal that Jack Riley was far more than a drifter. His story was only just beginning. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A bitter wind whipped around the corners of the city, carrying with it the first hints of a storm. He stood across the street, a ghost in tattered fatigues, watching the warm glow of the dealership. They called him Old Jack, the man who talked to engines. But they never knew the secrets those engines told him back. The rain began to fall in thick, slanting sheets, plastering Jack's thin jacket to his skin. He didn't seem to notice. His eyes, the color of a faded summer sky, were fixed on the gleaming chrome and polished steel of the cars inside Prestige Motors. He had once commanded legions of men and machines. Now, he commanded only the tremor in his hands and the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and crossed the street. The showroom was a cathedral of wealth. Soft lights gleamed on the hoods of cars that cost more than most people's homes. A young salesman, barely out of his teens, looked up from his phone, his face a mask of disdain as Jack shuffled in, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the pristine white tiles. "Can I help you?" the young man asked, his tone making it clear he wanted to do anything but. Jack's voice was raspy from disuse. "There's a car in the service bay," he said, gesturing with a trembling hand towards the back. "A vintage silver Aston Martin. The engine, it's not breathing right." The salesman, whose name tag read Kyle, let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Breathing right? Sir, our mechanics are the best in the business. I think they know what they're doing." He took a step forward, trying to subtly herd Jack towards the door. "Now, if you're not here to buy a car." "I'm not," Jack said, his gaze still on the service bay. "I'm here to fix it." He finally looked at Kyle, his eyes holding a depth of knowledge that the young man couldn't possibly comprehend. "And all I'm asking for in return is a hot meal." Kyle stared at him for a long moment, then burst out laughing. It was a cruel, mocking sound that echoed in the cavernous showroom. He turned to his colleagues, two other salesmen who were now watching the exchange with amusement. "Hey guys, get this. This old fella says he can fix the Aston Martin for a sandwich." The other salesman joined in the laughter. The owner of the dealership, a portly man in an expensive suit named Mr. Abernathy, emerged from his office, a frown creasing his brow. "What's all this commotion?" Kyle pointed a thumb at Jack. "This homeless guy wandered in off the street. Says he can fix Mrs. Davenport's Aston Martin for a meal." Mr. Abernathy's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Davenport was his most important client. Her car had been in his shop for a week, and his mechanics were stumped. They had thrown every diagnostic tool they had at it, replaced half the parts, and still, the engine sputtered and died. The pressure was mounting. He looked at the old man, at his tattered clothes, his grizzled beard, his calloused, trembling hands. It was absurd, but there was something in the man's eyes, a quiet confidence, a flicker of something he hadn't seen in a long time. "You think you can fix it?" Abernathy asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "I know I can," Jack replied simply. Abernathy was a gambler at heart. He had built his empire on risky bets. This was perhaps the most ridiculous one of his life, but what did he have to lose? "All right," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You've got a deal. You fix the car, you get a meal. The best meal in town on me. But if you can't," he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "then you get to clean my showroom floor with a toothbrush." The salesman snickered. Jack just nodded. "Fair enough." He walked towards the service bay, each step slow and deliberate. The mechanics, a team of 3 seasoned professionals, stopped what they were doing and stared as he approached. They had heard the commotion and were not pleased. "Who's this?" The head mechanic, a burly man named Gus, grumbled. "He's your new consultant," Abernathy said with a wink. Gus looked Jack up and down with open contempt. "You've got to be kidding me." Jack ignored him. He walked up to the Aston Martin, a magnificent machine even with its heart of steel silenced. He placed a hand on the cool metal of the hood, his eyes closing for a moment as if in prayer. The mechanics exchanged amused glances. "What's he doing?" one of them whispered. "Communing with the car gods?" Jack opened his eyes. He didn't need to look at the diagnostic reports or the array of sophisticated equipment scattered around the car. He had already heard everything he needed to know from the faint, irregular rhythm of the engine when they had tried to start it for him as he stood across the street. "It's the fuel pump," he said, his voice clear and steady now. "It's not the original. It's a modern replacement, and it's not calibrated to the car's original specifications. The pressure is all wrong." Gus scoffed. "We've checked the fuel pump. It's working fine." "You've checked to see if it's pumping fuel," Jack corrected him gently. "You haven't checked to see if it's pumping fuel correctly. There's a difference." He pointed to a small, almost imperceptible valve near the base of the engine. "That's a regulator valve. On this model, it's a delicate piece of machinery. Your new pump is forcing too much fuel through it, too fast. The engine is flooding itself. It's choking." The mechanics looked at each other, then at the engine, then back at Jack. They had been so focused on the high-tech components, the onboard computers, the electronic ignition, that they had overlooked the simple, mechanical elegance of the original design. Gus, his pride wounded, was not ready to concede. "And how would you know that?" Jack's gaze drifted to a faded tattoo on his forearm, a barely visible insignia of a unit that had been officially disbanded decades ago. "Let's just say," he said, his voice tinged with a sadness that none of them could understand, "that I've spent a lot of time with old soldiers. And this car is an old soldier. It needs to be treated with respect, not just new parts." He picked up a wrench, his hands surprisingly steady now. "Now, if you'll hand me that screwdriver, the small, flat-headed one, I'll show you what I mean." For the next hour, the service bay was silent except for the soft clinking of metal on metal. Jack worked with a quiet, focused intensity. His movements were fluid, economical, each one born of a lifetime of practice. The mechanics, who had started out as mocking observers, were now watching with a growing sense of awe. They were witnessing a master at work. Finally, Jack stepped back from the car, wiping his hands on a rag. "Try her now," he said. Gus got into the driver's seat, his face a mixture of hope and disbelief. He turned the key. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful purr that vibrated through the concrete floor. It was a sound they hadn't heard in a week, a sound of a perfectly tuned, perfectly balanced machine. Abernathy, who had been watching from a distance, walked over, his eyes wide with amazement. He looked at Jack, then at the car, then back at Jack. How did you do that?" Jack just smiled, a faint, sad smile. "I listened," he said. "That's all. I just listened to what she had to say." Abernathy led Jack into his office. It was a room designed to intimidate, with a large mahogany desk, leather chairs, and walls adorned with pictures of Abernathy shaking hands with minor celebrities. But Jack was not intimidated. He had stood in rooms where the fate of nations was decided. This was just a room. "I don't know who you are," Abernathy said, gesturing for Jack to sit. "But you are a genius. An absolute genius." He circled his desk, his eyes gleaming with a new kind of avarice. He wasn't just thinking about the money he would make from Mrs. Davenport. He was thinking about the money he could make from this old man. "I'm just a man who knows his way around an engine," Jack said, his voice quiet. He didn't sit. He preferred to stand. It was a habit from a lifetime of being on alert. "A man who knows his way around an engine?" Abernathy chuckled. "My friend, you are an artist. And I am a connoisseur of art." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "I have a proposition for you. I'll give you a room in the back of the shop, 3 square meals a day, and a small stipend. In return, you work for me. On the difficult cars. The ones that my artists can't seem to figure out." It was more than Jack had had in years. A roof over his head. The promise of food. A purpose. But it was also a cage. A gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. He looked out the window at the rain-streaked street. He had been free for so long, in his own way. Free from the expectations, the responsibilities, the ghosts. He thought of another rainy night, a lifetime ago. He was a young man then, barely 20, standing in the mud of a foreign land. The rain was coming down in torrents, just like tonight. He was working on the engine of a Jeep, its metal shell riddled with bullet holes. The engine was their only way out. Their lives depended on it. And he had fixed it. He had brought it back to life with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. He remembered the faces of the men he had saved that night. Their youthful, terrified, grateful faces. He had been a hero then, a legend. But legends, like old soldiers, fade away. He had come home from the war a changed man. The world he had fought for seemed to have no place for him. He tried to settle down, got a job at a garage, married a good woman, had a daughter. But the ghosts of the past were always there, lurking in the shadows. He saw them in the flash of a camera, heard them in the backfire of a car. He started to drink, to forget. But the drinking only made the ghosts louder. His wife left him, took their daughter with her. He didn't blame her. He had become a ghost himself. He drifted from town to town, from job to job, always running from something he could never escape. The open road became his only home. The rumble of an engine, his only friend. He was a master of his craft, but a failure at everything else. He was pulled back to the present by the sound of Abernathy clearing his throat. The dealership owner was looking at him, a flicker of impatience in his eyes. "So what do you say, Jack? Do we have a deal?" Jack looked at his hands. They were old hands, scarred and calloused, but they were still good hands. They could still bring things back to life. Maybe it was time to bring himself back to life. "I have one condition," Jack said. Abernathy raised an eyebrow. "Oh, I don't want a stipend," Jack said. "I just want the room, the meals, and a car." Abernathy laughed. "A car? My dear man, you can have your pick of the lot. Once you've proven your worth, of course." "Not one of these," Jack said, gesturing to the sleek, modern cars in the showroom. "I want something old, something broken, something that everyone else has given up on." Abernathy was intrigued. "And why would you want a piece of junk like that?" "Because," Jack said, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time, "I believe that everything and everyone deserves a second chance." Abernathy stroked his chin, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. He was a businessman, and he could smell an opportunity a mile away. This old man wasn't just a mechanic. He was a philosopher, a showman. He could be the new face of Prestige Motors, the wise, old master who could fix the unfixable. It was a marketing dream. "You've got a deal, Jack," Abernathy said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the family." Jack took his hand. The grip was firm, but cold. Jack knew he was making a deal with the devil, but he had been in hell before, and he had always found a way out. The next few weeks were a blur. Jack was given a small, windowless room in the back of the service bay. It wasn't much, but it was warm and dry. He was given 3 meals a day from a nearby diner. The food was greasy, but it was hot, and he was given a car. A rusted, dented, forgotten shell of a 1969 Ford Mustang that had been sitting in the back of the lot for years. Everyone thought Abernathy was crazy, but Abernathy knew what he was doing. Jack became a local legend. People would come from all over the city to see the old man who could talk to engines. They would bring him their hopeless cases, their basket cases, their cars that had been declared dead by every other mechanic in town. And Jack, with his quiet wisdom and his magic hands, would bring them back to life. He never used fancy equipment. He just listened. He listened to the whispers of the engine, the groans of the transmission, the sighs of the suspension. And he understood. He was happy, in his own way. He had a purpose again. He was respected. He was home. But the ghosts were still there. They were quieter now, but they were still there. And one day, a new ghost walked into his life. A ghost from a past he thought he had buried long ago. She was a young woman, no older than his own daughter would have been. She had the same fiery red hair, the same determined chin, the same sad, knowing eyes. She was driving a beat-up pickup truck that was belching black smoke. She walked up to him, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jeans. "Are you Jack?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "That's what they call me," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "They say you can fix anything. I can try." She took a deep breath. "Can you fix a broken heart?" Jack looked at her for a long moment. He saw the pain in her eyes, the pain he knew so well. He saw the ghost of his own daughter, the daughter he had abandoned so many years ago. "I don't know about hearts," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "But I can take a look at your truck." As he worked on the truck's engine, she told him her story. Her name was Sarah. She was a journalist. She was working on a story about homeless veterans, about the men who had been forgotten by the country they had served. She had heard about him from the other homeless men in the city. They called him the Ghost, the man who had been to hell and back. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know about the medals he had won, the men he had saved, the legend he had been. She just saw an old man in a greasy jumpsuit, a man who was good with his hands. And as she talked, Jack realized that he had been given a second chance. A chance to not just fix cars, but to fix his own broken life. A chance to finally confront the ghosts of his past. A chance to tell his story. The truck's engine was a mess. It was old, neglected, and abused, just like him. But as he worked, as he replaced the worn-out parts and cleaned the clogged-up filters, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long, long time. He was not just fixing an engine. He was healing a wound that had been festering for decades. When he was finished, the engine purred like a kitten. Sarah's eyes widened in amazement. "How did you do that?" Jack just smiled. "I listened," he said. "That's all. I just listened." She offered to pay him, but he refused. "Just tell my story," he said. "Tell the story of all the forgotten soldiers. That will be payment enough." She promised she would. And as she drove away, her truck running smoother than it had in years, Jack felt a flicker of hope in his heart. Maybe, just maybe, this time, he could finally find his way home. But the road home is never easy. And Jack's past was about to catch up with him in a way he never could have imagined. For, you see, the silver Aston Martin that he had fixed on that first rainy night, it didn't just belong to any rich woman. It belonged to the wife of a retired general. A general who had known a young, brilliant mechanic in the war. A mechanic who went by the name of Sergeant John Jack Riley. A man who had been declared missing in action, presumed dead, for over 40 years. General Davenport was a man accustomed to precision. In his long and decorated military career, every detail mattered. Every piece of information was a potential key to victory or defeat. So when his wife, Eleanor, returned home, her beloved Aston Martin purring like a contented lion, he was, of course, pleased. But he was also intrigued. She recounted the story of the strange, homeless man who had diagnosed the problem with a single touch, a man who seemed to understand the very soul of the machine. He called himself Jack, Eleanor said, sipping her tea in the drawing room of their stately home. A quiet man. Sad eyes. But his hands, my goodness, George, you should have seen his hands. They moved with such purpose. The name pricked at the general's memory. Jack. He'd known a Jack once. A young corporal in his unit. A boy with an uncanny gift for mechanics. They called him the Magician because he could coax life back into the most battered and broken down engines on the battlefield. A boy named John Riley. But everyone just called him Jack. Did he have a last name? The general asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Eleanor frowned. I don't believe so. Just Jack. Mr. Abernathy seemed to think it was all a grand spectacle, a bit of marketing genius on his part. He's already plastered the old man's face on a local billboard, the Auto Whisperer. The general stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. It couldn't be. Sergeant John Jack Riley had gone missing during a reconnaissance mission deep in enemy territory. A jeep, a blown-out tire, an ambush. There were no survivors. He was listed as missing in action, later declared killed. The general had written the letter to the young man's family himself. It was one of the hardest things he had ever had to do. He dismissed the thought. It was a coincidence. A trick of an old man's memory. Still, the story lingered, a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. A week later, the puzzle piece snapped into place. Sarah's article was published. It wasn't a front-page expose, but a quiet, human interest story in the Sunday paper's local section. The Ghost in the Machine, a veteran's second chance. She wrote about the homeless man named Jack, his quiet dignity, his almost supernatural ability to fix engines, and his simple request to have the stories of forgotten soldiers told. She didn't know his last name or his history, but she captured his essence. She wrote about his hands, how they seemed to listen to the metal. She wrote about his eyes, how they held a universe of unspoken sorrow. General Davenport read the article over his morning coffee. He saw the accompanying photograph, a grainy black and white image of Jack leaning against the rusted Mustang, his face partially obscured by shadow. But there was no mistaking the tattoo on his forearm, a faded insignia of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the general's old unit. The coffee cup trembled in his hand. It was him. After all these years. Alive. The world exploded. The story was picked up by the national news wires. The tale of the homeless hero, the legendary Sergeant Jack Riley, found working as a mechanic in a small-town dealership, was irresistible. It was a story of redemption, of forgotten valor, of the quiet resilience of the human spirit. Reporters descended on Prestige Motors like a swarm of locusts. Cameras and microphones were shoved in Jack's face. They wanted to know everything. Where had he been? Why had he hidden for so long? What did it feel like to be a hero? Jack was overwhelmed. He was a man who had spent his life in the shadows. He had sought anonymity, a quiet place where he could outrun his ghosts. Now, the brightest of spotlights was on him. He retreated into himself, into the familiar comfort of the engines. He refused all interviews, speaking only through Abernathy. Abernathy, of course, was in heaven. Prestige Motors became the most famous car dealership in the country. Business boomed. He milked the story for all it was worth, painting himself as the benevolent savior who had recognized the genius in the humble old man. He trademarked the name Auto Whisperer and started selling merchandise. T-shirts, coffee mugs, even a line of car care products. Jack saw none of the money. He didn't want it. He just wanted his little room, his 3 meals a day, and the solace of his work. He continued to fix the unfixable, his hands bringing order to the chaos of broken machinery, even as his own life descended into a new kind of chaos. And then, one day, she appeared. He was working on the Mustang, his sanctuary, carefully sanding down a patch of rust on the fender. He sensed a presence and looked up. A woman stood in the doorway of the service bay. She was in her early 40s, with the same red hair he saw in his dreams, the same determined chin, the same sad, knowing eyes as the young journalist, Sarah. But these eyes held something more. They held a lifetime of questions, a universe of pain. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Jack's hands froze. The sanding block fell to the floor with a soft thud. He had not heard that word in 40 years. He had not seen that face since it was a child's. His daughter, Elizabeth. He stood up slowly, his old bones protesting. He wanted to run to her, to hold her, to tell her he was sorry for everything. But he was paralyzed. The ghosts of his past rose up around him, their silent accusations filling the air. He was a failure, a drunk, a deserter. He had abandoned her. How could he possibly ask for her forgiveness? She took a step towards him, then another. Her eyes welled up with tears. "I thought you were dead," she said, her voice a mixture of anger and anguish. "They told us you were dead." "I was," he said, his own voice raspy with emotion. In a way, the reunion was not a happy one. It was a storm of unspoken resentments, of years of unanswered questions. Elizabeth, now a successful lawyer with a family of her own, had built a life on the foundation of his absence. His sudden reappearance was a shockwave that threatened to shatter that foundation. She had seen the news reports, of course. She had seen the face of the man she had only known from faded photographs. A man her mother had spoken of with a mixture of love and bitterness. A man who was a war hero to the world, but a ghost to his own family. They talked for hours, their conversation punctuated by long, painful silences. He told her about the war, about the things he had seen, the things he had done. He told her about the ghosts, about the drinking, about the running. He didn't make excuses. He just told her the truth. She, in turn, told him about her life, about growing up without a father, about the hole his absence had left in her heart, about the anger she had carried for so long. "Why?" she finally asked, the one question that mattered above all others. "Why did you never come home?" Jack looked at his hands, the hands that could fix anything but his own broken life. "Because," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I didn't know how. I was so broken. I didn't think I could ever be whole again. I thought you were better off without me." "That wasn't your decision to make," she said, her voice cold. The words hit him harder than any bullet. He knew she was right. Their meeting ended without resolution. She left him with a picture of his grandchildren, 2 smiling boys he had never met, and a promise to call. It was a small gesture, but it was a beginning. a fragile thread of hope in the tangled mess of his life. In the days that followed, Jack felt a shift within him. The ghosts were still there, but they were different now. They were no longer just specters of the men he had lost in the war. They were the ghosts of the life he had lost, the family he had abandoned. And for the first time, he felt a flicker of a desire to not just outrun them, but to face them, to make amends. He poured himself into the Mustang. The car became his confessional, his penance. Every dent he hammered out, every spot of rust he sanded away, was an act of contrition. He wasn't just restoring a car. He was trying to restore his own soul. Abernathy, oblivious to the turmoil in Jack's heart, saw only a new marketing opportunity. The reunion tour. He boomed one morning, bursting into the service bay with a new set of blueprints. We'll take the Mustang on the road. A cross-country trip. Father and daughter, reunited by a classic American car. It's a story that writes itself. Jack looked at the blueprints, then at Abernathy's gleaming, rapacious face. He had been a pawn for so long. A pawn of the army, a pawn of his own addictions, a pawn of this greedy little man. He had been a ghost, a legend, an auto whisperer. He had been everything but himself. He crumpled the blueprints in his fist. No, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Abernathy was taken aback. No? What do you mean, no? This car is not for sale, Jack said. And neither am I. He walked over to his workbench and picked up a small, intricately carved wooden box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a purple heart and a distinguished service cross. Medals he had never shown anyone. Medals he felt he had never deserved. He held them out to Abernathy. These are for you, he said. A down payment. Abernathy stared at the medals, his eyes wide. He knew what they were. He knew what they were worth. Not in money, but in something far more valuable. In sacrifice. In blood. A down payment for what? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jack looked at the Mustang. Its new coat of primer a dull, hopeful gray. For my freedom, he said. I'm buying myself back. Abernathy stared at the medals in his hand. The weight of them, both physical and symbolic, was immense. For a moment, the calculated avarice in his eyes was replaced by something else, a flicker of awe, perhaps even shame. He was a man who dealt in numbers, in profit margins and depreciation values. He understood the cost of a car, a building, a man's labor. But this was a currency he had never learned to calculate. The cost of courage. The price of sacrifice. What is this? He finally managed to say, his voice softer than Jack had ever heard it. It's a long overdue debt, Jack said. I've been running from who I was for 40 years. I hid behind a bottle, then I hid behind these walls. You gave me a roof and a purpose when I had nothing. I won't forget that. But you didn't save me, Mr. Abernathy. You just put me in a different kind of cage. A comfortable one, I'll admit. But I'm done with cages. So you're leaving? Abernathy asked, the businessman in him resurfacing. The panic was immediate. He was losing his star attraction, his golden goose. Just like that? After everything I've done for you. I'm not leaving, Jack corrected him. Not yet. I'm making you a business proposition. A final one. He gestured to the Mustang. I'm going to finish this car. It will be the finest machine that has ever rolled out of this shop. A masterpiece. And when it's done, it will be yours. Abernathy's eyes lit up. A car restored by the legendary Jack Riley? The auto whisperer. The publicity alone would be worth a fortune. Collectors would be lining up. In exchange, Jack continued, his voice steady and calm, I want 3 things. First, you will give me the legal title to that old pickup truck that the journalist, Sarah, left here. Second, you will give me enough spare parts and tools to set up a small shop of my own. Nothing fancy, just the basics. And third, you will let me go. No contracts, no marketing, no more stories. You will tell the world that the auto whisperer has retired. You can say I've gone to live with my family. You can say whatever you want. But my story, from that day forward, is my own. It was a brilliant move. Jack wasn't just buying his freedom. He was selling Abernathy a legend. The final, magnificent work of the master, before he vanished into myth. Abernathy, the shrewd businessman, recognized the value immediately. It was a better story than any cross-country tour. It had dignity. It had finality. It would make the Mustang priceless. And the medals? Abernathy asked, still holding the Purple Heart and the Distinguished Service Cross. They are a gift, Jack said. A reminder. of what some things are truly worth. Abernathy looked from the medals to Jack's determined face. He saw a man he had profoundly underestimated. He wasn't just a broken-down mechanic. He was a general commanding his own terms of surrender. And in that moment, for the first time, Abernathy felt a genuine stirring of respect. "You've got a deal, Jack," he said, extending his hand. This time, when Jack shook it, the grip felt different. It was a transaction between equals. The next month was one of almost monastic devotion. The world outside, with its clamoring reporters and insatiable curiosity, faded away. The service bay became Jack's sanctuary. He worked on the Mustang with a singular focus, a quiet intensity that left the other mechanics in awe. He was not just assembling parts. He was breathing life into steel. Elizabeth started to visit. At first, her visits were brief, tentative. She would bring him coffee and a sandwich, and they would talk awkwardly amidst the smell of grease and paint. She told him about her sons, his grandsons. Mark, the older one, was quiet and studious, a reader. Luke, the younger, was a ball of energy, obsessed with taking things apart to see how they worked. "He's like you," she said one afternoon, a small, sad smile on her face. Jack felt a pang in his chest. A whole life he had missed. A lineage he was a stranger to. He started saving parts for his grandsons. An old carburetor he polished until it gleamed. A set of vintage spark plugs. He explained to Elizabeth how they worked, his hands moving with the grace of a surgeon as he pointed out the intricate mechanisms. Through the language of the engine, he was trying to speak to a daughter he barely knew, to connect with grandsons he had never met. Slowly, the wall between them began to crumble. She saw the man he was now, not just the ghost who had haunted her childhood. She saw his quiet strength, his profound, unspoken regret. He, in turn, saw the remarkable woman she had become. Strong, intelligent, and compassionate, in spite of him. One evening, as he was putting the final touches on the Mustang's engine, she brought two small boys with her. They stood shyly behind their mother, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the nearly completed car. "Mark, Luke," Elizabeth said, her voice soft. "This is your grandfather." Jack's heart stopped. He wiped his hands on a rag and knelt, his old knees cracking in protest. He looked into their young, curious faces. He saw his own eyes looking back at him. "Hello," he said, his voice thick. Luke, the younger one, stepped forward. He pointed a small, grubby finger at the engine. "How does it do that?" he asked. "How do you make it go?" And Jack, the man who had been lost for so long, finally found his way home. He began to explain. He told them about the magic of combustion, of how a tiny spark could create a symphony of power. He spoke not of horsepower and torque, but of breath and heartbeat. He was not just teaching them about an engine. He was passing on a legacy. The day the Mustang was finished, it was a work of art. The body was a deep, lustrous black, polished to a mirror's shine. The chrome gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the service bay. But the real magic was under the hood. The engine was a masterpiece of mechanical harmony, every part tuned to perfection. When Jack turned the key, it didn't roar. It sang. A low, powerful, perfect hum. Abernathy brought in a professional photographer. He had already pre-sold the car to a wealthy collector in Japan for an astronomical sum. The legend of Jack Riley's final masterpiece had already spread through the rarefied world of high-end car collectors. Jack watched them take the pictures, a strange sense of detachment washing over him. He felt no pride of ownership. He had created it, but it did not belong to him. It was a price he had to pay, a ransom for his soul. His real treasure was standing in the doorway. Elizabeth, Mark, and Luke. After the photographer left, Jack handed the keys to Abernathy. "Our deal is done," he said. Abernathy nodded. He handed Jack a set of keys in return, along with a thick envelope. "The title to the pickup, as promised," he said, "and the deed to a small, abandoned garage on the edge of town. Consider it a bonus. For the medals." He cleared his throat, a rare moment of sincerity breaking through his polished exterior. "Good luck, Jack." "You too, Abernathy," Jack said. He walked away from the gleaming Mustang without a backward glance. He walked past the rows of expensive, soulless cars. He walked out of the bright lights of the showroom and into the soft light of the setting sun. His family was waiting for him. He had a broken-down pickup truck, a box of old tools, and a run-down garage to his name. He was, by the world's standards, a poor man. But as he looked at his daughter and his grandsons, their faces illuminated by the golden light of the evening, Jack Riley knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he was the richest man on earth. But freedom is a complicated thing. Jack had bought himself out of his contract with Abernathy, but he couldn't escape the legend the world had built around him. The small, abandoned garage he had been given was not as anonymous as he had hoped. People found him, not reporters, but people who were lost. People with broken cars and broken lives. An old woman whose only connection to the world was her sputtering 20-year-old sedan. A young man who had sunk his last dollar into a lemon of a sports car. A single mother whose minivan had died, threatening her ability to get to her 2 jobs. They came to him not just because he was a genius mechanic, but because he was a symbol of hope. He was the man who had come back from the dead. The man who could fix the unfixable. He never charged them much. Sometimes a hot meal. Sometimes a promise to pay it forward. His little garage became a different kind of dealership. It didn't run on money. It ran on kindness. And with every engine he healed, with every life he touched, Jack felt a piece of his own fractured soul knitting itself back together. He was finally doing what he was always meant to do. Not for glory, not for money, but for the simple, profound satisfaction of making something broken whole again. Life settled into a new rhythm, as steady and comforting as a well-tuned engine. Jack's garage, which he simply called Second Chance, became a quiet landmark on the forgotten edge of town. There was no sign, no advertising, just the occasional sight of a car being gently pushed into the bay and, a day or two later, driving out with a renewed spirit. People found their way there through whispers, a network of need and gratitude that spread through the city's humble corners. His days were filled with the familiar liturgy of his craft. He'd arrive at dawn, the cool morning air still smelling of dew and asphalt. His first act was always to brew a pot of strong, black coffee on an old hot plate, the aroma mingling with the familiar sense of oil and steel. He'd stand in the open doorway, sipping the hot liquid from a thick ceramic mug, and watch the city wake up. This quiet moment of observation was a luxury he had never afforded himself during his years on the run. It was a moment of peace, of belonging. Then, he would work. The work was constant. He fixed the sputtering engine of a nursing student's old, battered car, a vehicle so vital she called it her 4-wheeled scholarship. He listened patiently as she explained her fear of it breaking down on the way to her clinical rounds, and when he was done, he showed her how to check her own fluids and tire pressure, giving her a small measure of control over her anxious life. He didn't just fix the car, he eased a fear. He rebuilt the transmission on a carpenter's work truck, the man's only source of livelihood. The carpenter, a man with hands as calloused as Jack's, had been quoted a price at another shop that would have put him out of business. Jack did the work for the cost of the parts and a promise of a custom-built bookshelf for his grandsons. He patiently taught a young widow, recently and tragically bereaved, how to check her oil and change a tire, giving her a small piece of independence in a world that had suddenly become terrifying and lonely. Her gratitude was silent, expressed through tears that Jack pretended not to see. His payment was whatever they could offer: a bag of fresh vegetables from a community garden, a still-warm pie, a clumsy, heartfelt thank you card from a child, crayon drawings of cars taped to the garage wall. More often than not, it was just the quiet satisfaction of seeing a person drive away with one less burden to carry, their shoulders a little less slumped, their face a little less etched with worry. His relationship with Elizabeth blossomed in this new, quiet world. She would bring the boys to the garage on Saturdays. These became sacred days for Jack. Mark, the older one, was a pensive boy. He would sit quietly on a stool, devouring books, occasionally looking up to ask a surprisingly insightful question about physics or engineering, prompted by the mechanical ballet before him. "Grandpa," he'd ask, "is the principle of leverage that moves a wrench the same as the one that moves a planet?" Jack would smile and try to explain the grand, beautiful mechanics of the universe in the simple terms of a nut and a bolt. But it was Luke who was Jack's shadow, his true apprentice. The boy was a natural, his small hands possessing an innate curiosity and an intuitive understanding of how things fit together. Jack started him on small tasks: cleaning spark plugs until they shone, sorting nuts and bolts into old coffee cans, learning the names and functions of the tools, which he treated with a reverence that delighted Jack. He taught the boy not just the mechanics of the engine, but its philosophy. "You see this?" Jack said one afternoon, holding up a greasy carburetor he was rebuilding. "People think it's just a piece of metal, a collection of springs and jets. But it's not. It's a lung. It has to breathe just right. Not too much air, not too much fuel. It's all about creating the perfect mixture, the perfect balance. Everything in life is about balance, Luke. Remember that." The boy would nod, his eyes wide with concentration, a permanent smudge of grease on his nose. In those moments, Jack wasn't just a grandfather. He was a bridge to a past the boy had never known, a guide to a future full of possibilities. He was repairing more than just machines. He was repairing the broken chain of his own family, linked by precious, powerful link. One cool autumn evening, as Jack was wiping down his tools, preparing to close up the shop, a sleek, black sedan pulled up. It whispered to a halt, its quiet confidence a stark contrast to the usual sputtering arrivals at his door. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in this part of town. A man in a crisp, dark suit stepped out. For a fleeting moment, Jack's old instincts flared, a lifetime of running making him want to retreat into the shadows. But he stood his ground, wiping his hands slowly on a rag. He was done running. The man was not a reporter or a government official. He introduced himself as General Davenport's aide. The general, he explained, was requesting a personal visit. It wasn't an order, the aide was careful to stress, but a heartfelt plea from one old soldier to another. Jack agreed. The next day, he put on a clean set of work clothes, the best he had, and drove Sarah's old pickup truck to the general's stately home. It was a world away from his garage, a world of manicured lawns, ancient oak trees, and a quiet, imposing wealth. General Davenport was waiting for him in his study, a room filled with books, maps, and the ghosts of old campaigns. He was friendlier than Jack remembered from their brief, transactional encounters at the dealership. The sharp lines of his face had been softened by age, but his eyes were still as piercing as ever. "Sergeant Riley," the general said, rising slowly from his large leather chair. "It's good to see you." "It's just Jack now, sir," Jack replied, his voice calm. The general gestured to a chair. "Please." He didn't waste time with small talk. He was a man of purpose, even in his distress. "I didn't ask you here to talk about the old days, Jack. I asked you here because I have a problem. One that no amount of money or influence seems to be able to solve." Jack expected him to talk about a car. A rare vintage model, perhaps. A mechanical puzzle. But the general pointed not to the garage, but to a small, silver picture frame on his desk. It was a photo of a young man in an army uniform, his smile bright and full of a life that seemed, even in the still image, boundless. "My grandson," the general said, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw and sharp. His name was David. He served 2 tours in the latest conflict. Came back, different, changed. The general explained. David had survived the war, but the war had not survived in him. He was haunted by the things he'd seen, the things he'd done. He couldn't connect with his family, couldn't hold down a job, couldn't find peace in the quiet of his own home. He had retreated into the impenetrable silence of his own mind. And now, the general said, his voice breaking, the carefully constructed dam of his military composure finally cracking. He's retreated into the garage. He has an old Jeep, one of the originals, from my father's time in his war. He spends all day, every day, out there, taking it apart, putting it back together. Over and over. He doesn't talk to us. He doesn't talk to the doctors. He just works on that engine. And he can't fix it. It never starts. I think if he can't fix that Jeep, he believes he can't fix himself." The general looked at Jack, his eyes pleading, stripped of all rank and authority. "They told me you can talk to engines, Jack, but I think you can do more than that. I think you understand the men who hide in them. I'm not asking you to fix the Jeep. I'm asking you to fix my grandson." It was the hardest thing anyone had ever asked of him, to willingly walk back into the heart of the storm he had spent his whole life fleeing, to face the very ghosts that had chased him into the wilderness of his own despair. He looked at the photo of the young soldier, David, and he saw himself. He saw the same haunted eyes, the same desperate search for an escape in the cold, logical embrace of a machine. He had to do it. It was a debt he owed, not to the general, but to the young, broken man he used to be. The next morning, Jack went to the Davenport estate. He didn't wear his mechanic's jumpsuit. He wore simple, clean clothes. He was not there as the auto whisperer. He was there as Jack. He found David in a large, pristine garage that looked more like a laboratory than a workshop. He was a mirror image of the photo on the desk, but the light in his eyes had gone out. He was hunched over the Jeep's engine, his hands covered in grease, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The garage was filled with parts, some meticulously cleaned and laid out on cloths, others lying in piles of rusted despair. It was a scene of ordered chaos, the physical landscape of a troubled mind. Jack didn't say anything at first. He just stood in the doorway and watched, his senses taking in the scene. He could see the problem with the engine immediately. A cracked distributor cap, a frayed primary wire to the coil. Simple, novice fixes. But he knew this wasn't about the engine. Not really. He walked over and picked up a wrench from the floor. "Mind if I help?" he asked quietly. David didn't look up. He just shrugged, a barely perceptible movement of his shoulders. For the next few hours, they worked in a profound, unbroken silence. Jack didn't try to fix the main problem. Instead, he started on small, peripheral things. He began by cleaning a single spark plug, his motions slow and deliberate. He tightened a loose bolt on the fender. He began to organize the scattered tools, placing each one back in its proper place on a large pegboard, creating a small island of order in the sea of chaos. He didn't offer advice. He just worked alongside the boy, a silent, steady, non-judgmental presence. Finally, Jack paused. He looked at the engine, then at David. "She's an old soldier," Jack said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Sometimes they get tired. Sometimes they forget why they're fighting." David stopped working, his hands hovering over the engine block. He looked at Jack for the very first time, his eyes wary, suspicious. "I knew a lot of Jeeps like this," Jack continued, his gaze distant, looking back through the decades. "They'd take a beating, get shot up, blown up. We'd patch them together with whatever we had and send them back out into the fight. But sometimes, the damage wasn't on the outside. It was something deep inside. A timing gear stripped by a sudden shock, a main bearing worn out from stress. Something you couldn't see, but you could hear it in the sound of the engine. A rattle, a knock, a hesitation. The engine, it loses its heart." He looked directly at David, his gaze unwavering. "It's not the broken parts that are the hardest to fix. It's the heart." A single, hot tear traced a clean path through the grease on David's cheek. "I left them behind," he whispered, his voice hoarse and cracked from disuse. "My friends, I left them." And then, the story poured out of him. A torrent of guilt, and fear, and unspeakable pain. An ambush on a dusty road. A firefight. A split-second decision he had to make as the vehicle commander. He had survived. His friends had not. He was living with the ghosts of the men he couldn't save, their faces appearing in his dreams, their voices echoing in the silence. Jack listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't judge. He just listened, his presence a quiet anchor in the boy's storm of grief. He had heard this story before, in the broken whispers of men in field hospitals, in the bottom of 1,000 whiskey glasses. He had lived this story, and when David was finished, his body trembling with the force of his long-overdue confession, Jack placed a firm, steady hand on his shoulder. "The war ends," Jack said, his voice filled with a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. "They tell you it's over, and you come home. But the fight, the real fight to actually come home, that's a different battle. And you don't have to fight it alone." He pointed to the cracked distributor cap. "The engine's heart is broken," he said. "But we can fix it. Together." They worked through the afternoon. Jack guided David's hands, showing him how to replace the cap, how to carefully strip and mend the frayed wire. He explained how the spark had to be timed just right, how the smallest connection, the most overlooked detail, was essential for the whole machine to work. As they worked, Jack talked. He told David his own story, a story he had never told in its entirety to anyone but his daughter. He spoke of the men he had lost, of the crushing guilt he had carried for decades, of the long, lonely years he had spent running from himself. He showed David the scars on his soul, and in doing so, he showed him that wounds, even the deepest ones, could eventually heal. When they were done, the engine was whole again. "Try her now," Jack said. David hesitated, his fear of failure palpable. Then he slid into the driver's seat. He took a deep, shuddering breath and turned the key. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. It was a strong, steady, powerful sound. A sound of resurrection. David looked at Jack, his eyes filled with a light that had been extinguished for years. It was more than just an engine. It was hope, singing on the autumn air. Jack knew his work was done. He had not fixed a Jeep. He had helped a young soldier begin the long, arduous journey home. As he walked out of the garage, General Davenport was waiting for him. The old soldier's face was a mask of profound gratitude. He tried to offer Jack money, a reward, anything. Jack shook his head. He's a good kid, General. Just listen to him. That's all he needs. Someone to listen. Jack returned to his small garage, to his quiet life. The world would never know what he had done. There would be no headlines, no awards. But Jack didn't need them. He had found something better. He had found peace. A few weeks later, a different pickup truck pulled up to his garage. It was an old, beat-up model, but the engine purred with a smooth, confident rhythm. David stepped out. He was clean-shaven, his eyes were clear, and he stood a little taller. He was holding a small, intricately made wooden box. "I made this for you," he said, handing the box to Jack. Jack opened it. Inside, perfectly organized in custom-cut velvet, was a set of antique watchmaker's tools, each one polished to a high shine. "My other grandfather. He used to fix clocks," David said, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "He told me it was all about finding the rhythm again after something made it stop. I thought you'd understand." Jack looked at the young man, at the life that was starting anew before him. He saw the past and the future, the soldier he was and the man David could become. The circle was complete. That evening, as the sun set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the concrete floor of his garage, Jack was cleaning his tools. His daughter and grandsons would be there soon for dinner. The smell of Elizabeth's cooking already seemed to drift on the breeze. He heard a noise and looked up. A young man, barely a teenager, stood in the doorway. His clothes were torn, his frame was thin, and his eyes were filled with a desperate, familiar hunger. The boy looked at a broken-down motorcycle in the corner, a sad-looking machine with a flat tire and a tangled chain, then back at Jack. His voice was trembling, barely a whisper. "Mister," he asked, "can I fix it for a meal?" Jack looked at the boy, and for a fraction of a second, he saw himself, a ghost in a rainstorm standing outside a fancy dealership, a lifetime ago. But the man who stood in the garage now was not a ghost. He was solid. He was present. He was whole. He smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his faded blue eyes and smoothed the weary lines on his face. He picked up a clean rag from his workbench and tossed it to the boy. "Son," he said, his voice gentle but strong, "you don't have to fix it for a meal, but you can help me fix it. And then, we'll eat together." Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.